today we're going to talk about the new operating system by Huawei. I think it's 2 years ago, right? So under Trump,
It's been in
there was
the
this whole
making,
thing.
right? Under Trump. Actually, in fact, longer than that. Since Trump started sort of attacking Huawei with first the chairman's daughter, and then after that sanctions on Huawei and blocking blocking US tech companies from having any business interactions with Huawei. That means, in that same aspect, companies like Google so on cannot deal with Huawei. And just imagine, just put it into perspective. Android is made by Google. Huawei's phones used to use the Android OS.
So that was the most conflicting sort of thing, and in the tech world, it was a bit divided. But Google came out to say, well, if Huawei doesn't use Android, that would be a national security, because it's sort of like, well, not a national security, but they were talking about, which you could also understand, is that right now they're using our stuff. They're building everything that they have on our stuff, and now you're saying that. I think in Trump's government perspective was maybe to cripple the fact that you wouldn't have anything. But the thing is, obviously, like, I think there's always been this push from Huawei because I think they've started to build their own operating system ever since 2012 or something. So it goes a way back. But the time to make the switch. The longer the time you make the switch, the better it was for Android because, obviously they profited from the licensing fee and, for a lot of other things, it's just more compatible. The Android is the biggest operating system, right? Because every other phone manufacturer other than Apple uses Android as a base layer before they start to add their own sort of like flavor to it. But everything uses Android.
I think the market share is about 70-30? Around there.
Yeah, and it's a much smaller piece of the cake. The reason why Apple is also like the most profitable is because, they target the high end and therefore they're able to sell their device at a much higher cost. Because a lot of Android phones, especially you think about like, if you don't think about the flagships and, the new Samsung or the new sort of Google Pixel and stuff, most of those phones are like pretty cheap, right? Like there's a lot of Android phones that goes for like $100-$200. And those are like what's making the volume essentially, right? So now there's a lot of things about Harmony OS. A lot of people are saying, well, it's just a copycat of Android and it's really nothing new. And well, we would like to disagree with this in the podcast, but obviously, it will definitely resemble Android, right? Because you don't need to reinvent the wheel, but there is a lot of fundamental difference that also show the sort of ambitions of Huawei for the future and the sort of overall, where tech is heading towards to, right? Huawei's been working on their Harmony OS for a long time, as I said earlier. They've been starting probably around 2012. So they finally announced it last year. There's been a lot of trailer. I think this year was the first year that they actually, pushing it out on phones. But even these days, I'm looking around and I think a lot of people, except if you're a beta tester, it's not on, production phones yet.
I think it's going to take a while, right? They just released it in June. I think 2nd of June. But if you're familiar with it, you would find the Harmony OS. This is Harmony OS 2. So you find Harmony OS being released on their smart TVs since 2020. But I guess the whole background and the whole operating system behind is slightly different between the first version and this version. Because if I'm not wrong, the first version is pretty much very similar to Android, right? And then in this version, they probably spend a year refining things and trying to draw a difference. And the point is that they are not trying to replicate Android. They are trying to make an independent system that have a bigger use than just mobiles.
Yeah, so that's the biggest difference, right? So I think if you've watched the presentation, they've emphasized IoT maybe 1,100 times, like 100,000 times.
Literally every 15 minutes.
Yeah, they're just talking about, the Internet of Things, how Harmony OS is really wanting to create this ecosystem from the ground up. they're partnering with like home appliance giants such as how do you pronounce this in English? Midea?
Media.
Media. Yeah. DJI, the drone sort of giant in the world, which we'll really do an episode on DJI. They're like super interesting company. Watchmaker Tissot and Swatch. They're really sort of focusing on making sure that their sort of operating system is really oriented to the Internet of Things. So it's an interesting position because as much as the Internet of Things is going to be, it is a huge deal already, right? You think about wearables, you think about smart appliances, you think about where this overall direction is going towards too, is definitely going to be the future because, in the future, you'll probably, everything that you own will be more or less connected.
That's the vision, right? But I guess increasingly, it'll take a bit of time for that to sort of assimilate everywhere, right? Right now, when you buy new appliances, they're selling it as an additional function. But I think the point is that it needs to be an embedded function in every single device before it becomes sort of a norm for everyone, right?
But also when you think about it is that it's still hard because ultimately the way you interact with an operating system is, like you don't need to sort of control your smart appliances all the time. If you think, I'm taking, for example, people who use iPhones. In iPhones, you have this ecosystem connected with an app, right? That is the Home OS, and that is the Home app. And although Apple is coming up and, with ambitions to improve on the Home OS, and, there's the whole thing with like the standardization of like smart appliances and everything, it's still something that is pretty in the works right now. Like it's not something that's concrete. Plus, like this new form of operating system is not going to be as much, like sort of something that you interact with directly, right? Because it's more something that you'll be speaking to, right? To your smart Alexa or your Google or whatever, or your Siri for those who really want to speak to Siri for some reason. But it's not something that's going to be as front-facing, and therefore this IoT aspect of the focus of Harmony OS is a bit harder to grasp, right? But if we come back a bit and we talk about, okay, now you've got this new operating system that is not yet in the phones, but what is the biggest challenge, right? Why would people sort of support you? In the world now, there is just really a binary choices of between Android and, sort of the Apple's iOS. Why would people use Harmony OS, right? And I think even for a Chinese user, you could say, well, support the country, right? Support the sort of national champion. Yeah, but that will only get you so far, right? One of the biggest challenges that you'll have is that, if your operating system is not compatible with any of the apps, which is, 100% of what people need these days, obviously it's going to be compatible with like the national champions, WeChat and everything. So maybe that's going to be enough, right? I think WeChat is always this big sort of like center of gravity when you talk about operating system, because, even when Apple was sort of facing criticism in China and everything, it was a big thing whereby people were saying, people don't care about the Apple ecosystem because if WeChat can't be on Apple's devices, which was like sort of rumored to be under the Trump administration and the ban on WeChat and everything, they were saying, well, that would hurt Apple's margins so much because people will just switch to something else if they can't use WeChat.
I mean, from that perspective, it's just like saying if you can't use WhatsApp, what's how important it is in your daily usage of your phone. Nowadays, people, it's like saying you buy a phone but you can't call.
Yeah, I think it's worse than that, right? Because like I think, and we've emphasized this 100 times as well, is that it's not just saying that you can't use WhatsApp if you buy a phone. It's saying that you can't use WhatsApp, Deliveroo, you can't use Uber, it's like all of those, because WeChat represents so much more than just a messaging system, right? But that's the thing, yeah. So that's if Harmony OS is definitely going to be compatible with the national champions when it comes to tech, right? Because but that's also part of a bigger push because they're all going to be compatible with all Android apps. So that's sort of normal because that's sort of the standard. Like you're coming with a new operating system, you want to make sure at least all the apps that exist today can be on your operating system. Now, the question remains to see whether, first of all, is that going to diverge, right? Are people going to have to do something for Harmony OS? Because right now, yes, your app is compatible, but what if you come up with an update? You know, Harmony OS is not going to follow Android on a parallel basis. Therefore, next year or in 2 years' time, when there are fundamental changes to the way Android operates and then Harmony OS operates, then would developer need to code something for both Harmony OS and Android? Therefore, if that happens, are developers willing to do the push?
Yeah, I guess that at the point, right? I mean, right now, any app developer would be pretty much coding their apps in maybe two forms in for iOS and then for Android. And then if you have Harmony OS, that means you need to code for 3 different ones. Right? Once you start getting a deviation, then it becomes is it worth spending time to do that, to keep up with the changes and constantly update because of all these deviations?
So that would be, definitely worthwhile if there's enough people using Harmony OS, right? And especially like the Chinese market is really big, so I don't think
No, but the thing is, it's a chicken and egg problem there. You see, because
exactly yes.
You see, it's first of all right now. I mean, from at this point right now, only Huawei said that they'll use Harmony OS, right? We know that Huawei.
Well, but
yeah, because it's their OS, right? They 2 years back they were the 3rd largest phone maker, right? Right now, for the past 2 years, their market share has dropped significantly. Even even Honor, which is the budget version of Huawei that spun out of Huawei last year, came out to say that they'll still continue using Android. You have Oppo, you have Xiaomi, you have other brands that will still continue to use Android. Maybe not because they don't support Huawei or whatsoever, but it's just such a big switch into, like you said, a foreign environment, whereby there's a lot of unproven usage. You might have issues with apps. Will be a big challenge for their business and their sales.
Yeah, if Harmony OS is ever going to make it, it needs to be good enough for people to want to transition to it, and that includes all the national champions. That includes Honor, Oppo, Xiaomi, OnePlus, and all of those phone makers that are so famous now, even in the West, but like especially in Southeast Asia and in India, for example, right? And you really need, if Harmony OS is ever going to be something more than just the operating system that Chinese people use or the operating system that China uses, it needs to be good, and it needs to be something not necessarily exceptional, but it needs to be reliable. It needs to be able to compete.
No, I think it needs to be exceptional. It needs to be extremely competitive. It needs to be there must be some functionality that makes it better than Android to get people to switch. Right? Essentially, why would you switch when everything is doing well right now? Are you just switching for the sake of switching, or because you're switching because I see that it's positioned differently and I see that it's positioned on a trajectory that would be helpful in the long run?
I think the national champions might be the first one to make the switch, maybe for more like the same reason why Huawei had to make the switch, sort of like maybe for security reasons and for the long-term sustainability reasons. And then that will come to the push of these hardware makers to, if they dominate a market, then maybe other smaller phone makers are going to switch. But it is hard to see, for now at least. I have a hard time imagining non-Chinese companies adopting Harmony OS.
In fact, actually, I would think differently. No, I would think the Chinese hardware makers would make the switch first to have Harmony OS compatible.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Than the Chinese players, the Chinese phone players. That means Oppo and Xiaomi will probably be later, right? Versus the appliances. Versus IoT appliances and
yeah,
companies.
but like the appliances, I think those will be just a matter of as in appliances. I don't think you'll have to make a single choice, right? The same way your Robo Vacuum is compatible with Alexa and Google and Apple. I think for the appliances, they just need to integrate like they'll be compatible with maybe all 3, or I think that's fine, especially with the Zigbee alliance, which is the alliance to sort of standardize the way Internet of Things will operate and how they're compatible with everything. It seems that everything will be compatible with everything essentially, right? So I think in terms of appliances, that won't be really an issue. It's more about it does really look like, at least for the short term, that it's going to be sort of a national thing, right? More than an international thing.
Yeah, it's just like how we see the consumer apps, right? The difference in consumer apps, about you have the Chinese version of everything, and then you see them deviating in terms of where they grow, right? So right now in China, when it comes to Harmony OS, it's in this budding phase, right? It would probably look very similar to Android, or rather, it looks very similar to Android, but going forward, as it develops, as it finds different functionality, it will be different.
Yeah, but and I think as a tech enthusiast, I'm just really happy to see more competition. And I think if you have more competition, if you have more sort of things in the world, it's just going to make it more interesting. First of all, on the tech side, right, to see what things Huawei can come up with and future tech companies are going to come up with. The same way, I think, because that's the name we've mentioned earlier, DJI, one of the biggest drone companies, that's something that was pioneered. Like, I mean, the drone technology has definitely not been pioneered in China per se, but DJI being such a big company and, having such establishment in the market, it was really interesting. And it's really good to see China coming up with their sort of own national champions and establishing themselves into the market as leaders, right? Because DJI is definitely a leader in the drone market. You can see with the sort of Insta360 and the sports camera. I think just having more sort of head-to-head competition, forgetting about like just what you've mentioned, the sort of security threat and everything, is just nice, right? Like competition, it is always good for consumers at the end of the day. So yeah. We'll end the episode here. I think the Huawei was much more of a sort of open-ended discussion, so apologies if it was not as structured. But it's definitely a very interesting question that I think, first of all, we want to bring to light the fact that, Huawei came up with their own sort of operating system. And I think a lot of people don't understand how binary the operating system choice is, right? Because a lot of people say, my Samsung doesn't use the same thing as maybe the Google Pixel or whatever, but all the underlying is Android, just with refinements on top of it by the phone manufacturer, and therefore having a third operating system is huge just in general, but what it represents is even bigger. So it's really interesting to see, and there's just so many questions surrounding it that will like sort of unfold themselves over the next few years. So we'll end the episode here. As always, thanks guys for listening. You can catch us at Productive Lazy Sundays on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. I feel like I'm forgetting a social platform, but yeah. As always, we'll catch you guys on the next episode.